Leadership, the inner structure of true leadership. Welcome. What you are about to hear is a shortened, contemplative version of a longer audiobook titled Leadership, the inner structure of true leadership. This version is not meant to summarize or simplify the work. It is meant to distill it, to offer a slower, quieter path into its core ideas, suited for listening, reflection, and rest. This book is not about techniques, motivation, or performance. It is about what leadership requires inside a human being: the capacity to remain steady under pressure, to carry responsibility without losing oneself, and to recognize when to step forward and when to step away. You are not expected to agree with everything you hear. You are invited only to listen carefully and to notice what settles and what resists as the words unfold. Written by Aren, Kairos. Narrated by Lyra, Selene. Preface. There is a quiet but decisive difference between leading and merely performing leadership. Many people can replicate the outward gestures. They can stand at the front of a room, speak with borrowed confidence, assert direction, and imitate conviction. They can adopt the posture of authority so convincingly that, for a time, even they may believe it. But posture is not leadership. Volume is not leadership. Performance is not leadership. Leadership is the willingness to carry weight, the emotional, psychological, and existential weight that others either cannot bear or refuse to acknowledge. It is the steadying force people orient themselves around when the world begins to tilt. It is the spine that must remain unbroken, even as everything surrounding it begins to fracture. This book is not a collection of strategies, techniques, or motivational slogans. It does not concern itself with charisma, persuasion, or the aesthetics of influence. Its focus is the inner structure of leadership, the quiet discipline that allows a person to remain in contact with reality when fear distorts perception, to refuse self-deception, to steady others through presence, and to protect without dominating. It also confronts the final demand of leadership: the courage to step away when the work is complete, leaving behind not dependence, but continuity. Leadership often begins in ambition, the desire to rise, to prove oneself, to shape events. But it cannot end there. Ambition burns out. Ego collapses. Circumstance humbles. Real leadership begins only after this collapse, when outward identity falls away and the person who remains discovers the capacity to hold others without needing to be held in return. What follows is not instruction so much as recognition. Those who have carried weight before will recognize themselves here. Those preparing to carry such weight will find a map, not of tactics, but of the inner terrain that must be cultivated, protected, and eventually relinquished. Leadership is not something one takes from the world. Leadership is something one becomes, and, when the time comes, something one must be willing to let go. Note to the reader: this is not a book to be consumed. It is a mirror. When a passage strikes you, stop. Sit with it. Let the words land, and notice what they disturb, or what they awaken in you. Some sections will confirm what you already know about yourself. Others will press against what you would rather not see. Both are necessary. Do not rush. Leadership is not learned by moving quickly through ideas, but by spending time inside yourself while you meet them. Part 1. The Animal of Leadership. Chapter 1. The Social Animal. Leadership does not begin in philosophy, political theory, or moral instruction. It begins beneath language itself, in the pre-linguistic layers of the nervous system, where organisms learn to coordinate under pressure. Long before humans told stories about power or justice, life had already solved the problem of collective survival through orientation around a stabilizing presence. Wherever organisms live in groups, patterns of coordination emerge spontaneously, not as ideology, but as function. These patterns reduce internal conflict, sharpen attention, and give the group a single point of reference when conditions become unstable. Hierarchy, in its original form, is not a cultural imposition. It is a biological response to entropy. If every member of a group carried equal authority in moments of stress, the group would fracture the instant pressure arrived. Coordination requires asymmetry. It requires a pivot, someone whose orientation becomes the anchor others align themselves around. This is not domination. It is coherence. A flock turns because one bird moves first. A pack adjusts because one animal recognizes the opening earlier than the rest. A group of humans steadies because one person's calm reorganizes the room. This is leadership before speech, before intention, before ideology. The body choosing where to stand when everything else begins to tremble. People like to believe they choose leaders through logic or values. They do not. Leadership is recognized through a felt sense, a pre-verbal perception that this person will not shatter under pressure. A leader is the one whose nervous system remains intact when others begin to break. Calm, long before competence or charisma, is the original currency of leadership. It is the primal signal that standing near this person increases the chance of survival. For this reason, leadership is not primarily intellectual. It is physiological. The leader's body becomes a regulating presence within the group. Their steadiness lowers collective anxiety and stabilizes perception. A true leader absorbs the fear of others, metabolizes it internally, and returns something calmer and clearer. Leadership is not superiority. It is metabolization. The leader functions as the nervous system of the group. This is also why leadership cannot be faked. Performative calm collapses when real pressure arrives. Inflated confidence evaporates under genuine threat. Those who rely on posture rather than regulation are betrayed by their bodies. In contrast, real leaders often appear quiet, not from lack of authority, but from capacity. They are listening, absorbing, orienting. Leadership is not loud. Leadership is the ability to remain oneself when the world applies pressure. Before a leader can command anything externally, they must be able to hold internally. They must hold coherence when others unravel, and steadiness when uncertainty grows teeth. This is the first law of leadership. If you cannot hold yourself, you cannot hold others. Everything that follows rests on this foundation. Leadership does not begin in ideas. It begins in the body. Chapter 2. The Leader as Signal. Before a leader speaks, plans, or decides anything, they are felt. Long before ideas are understood or competence is evaluated, a leader radiates a signal, an orientation the group leans toward instinctively. Leadership does not begin with declarations or commands. It begins with a nervous system that remains coherent when the environment becomes unstable. A leader is not first a role or title, but a stabilizing presence that lowers collective anxiety. In moments of uncertainty, groups do not follow ideas. They follow the one who does not break. Presence is the leader's first form of communication. Without speaking, a true leader signals, "I am not overwhelmed. I can see. I will not collapse under this moment." This is not theatrical confidence or staged optimism. Those dissolve under pressure. Presence cannot be faked because it is not behavior, it is physiological. It emerges from self-mastery, from knowing what matters and refusing to panic as others begin to fragment. The group feels this presence as animals feel calm or tension within a herd. It is a stabilizing field, not a performance. Every group carries an emotional climate. The leader becomes its regulator. Their nervous system functions as the metronome for the collective. When the leader grows anxious, anxiety spreads. When the leader steadies, the group synchronizes. This is not metaphor. It is biology. Humans regulate one another through the same ancient mechanisms that allow flocks and packs to coordinate under threat. Leadership begins not by commanding people, but by shaping the emotional field they inhabit. Presence must also appear at the right moment. Leadership does not require constant display, but it does require timely emergence, stepping forward when coherence begins to fail, neither too early nor too late. Appearing at that moment communicates a single message: the center still holds. Authority is embodied. It cannot be delegated. The group must see the one who remains steady. Over time, the leader's presence becomes symbolic. The group does not attach to personality or charm, but to the stability the leader represents. Performative leaders burn out because admiration collapses under pressure. Real leadership is built on containment, the capacity to hold the emotions of others without losing oneself. The leader becomes the image of coherence. When that image fractures, the world the group lived inside fractures with it. Leadership begins before intention. One does not choose presence and then become a leader. Presence appears first, and leadership is noticed. The moment people turn toward you in uncertainty, leadership has already begun. From then on, it is no longer about desire. It is about whether you can withstand being the one others depend on. Chapter 3. The Need for a Center. Every group, regardless of size or purpose, requires a center, something around which attention, meaning, and emotional life can organize. That center may be a person, a value, a memory, a myth, or a shared vision. Whatever form it takes, there must be a gravitational point that holds the whole together. Without a center, a group does not merely drift, it fractures. Direction dissolves into reaction, coordination collapses into anxiety, and purpose disintegrates into confusion. Leadership, in its most essential form, is the act of bearing that center, holding meaning steady so the group does not collapse inward under uncertainty. The first function of the center is to organize attention. Wherever attention goes, identity begins to form. The leader does not simply guide action. They determine what the group notices, what it ignores, what it treats as threat, and what it recognizes as opportunity. When a leader's attention is scattered, the group becomes chaotic. When it is disciplined, the group aligns. In moments of crisis, the leader's perceptual frame quietly becomes the group's reality. This is why leadership is cognitive before it is directive. A leader begins not by telling people what to do, but by defining what is real enough to matter. The center also resolves uncertainty. Uncertainty is not an exception to life, it is its default condition. Most people cannot face the unknown without anxiety because it threatens internal coherence. The leader stands before the unknown without rushing to fill it with panic or false certainty. Their stillness allows perception to deepen rather than collapse. This stillness is not hesitation, it is clarity under pressure. The leader sees further precisely because they do not turn away from what is unclear. Fear, too, must be held by the center. Fear spreads through groups faster than information or reason. The leader's task is not to deny it or suppress it, but to absorb it. They allow fear into awareness without letting it distort orientation. What they metabolize internally returns to the group as steadiness and grounded direction. Leadership is therefore emotionally expensive. It is metabolic work, taking in what the group cannot process and returning something usable. When no center holds, groups fragment, factions form, egos expand to fill the vacuum, and each person begins managing their own version of reality. Communication shatters, suspicion replaces trust, and coordination becomes impossible. This is not dramatic conflict. It is entropy, the slow unraveling of coherence. A leader functions as the invisible force that prevents this dissolution. For a center to hold, it must be trusted. Authority does not arise from strength or charisma. It arises from the group's belief that the one at the center will not abandon them, will not collapse under pressure, and will not use them for ego or self-protection. Obedience can be coerced. Coherence cannot. Leadership begins when one person becomes the point others can stand inside without losing themselves. Chapter 4. The First Criterion. If leadership is stripped to its most primitive layer, before words, titles, or culture, only one criterion remains. People follow the one who stays calm. Not the strongest, not the loudest, not the cleverest. They follow the one whose inner world does not break when the outer world begins to shake. This is the oldest selection mechanism in nature. When danger thins perception and distorts judgment, the one who remains whole becomes the point of orientation for everyone else. Calm is not the absence of fear. Calm is fear metabolized into clarity. Threat is not simply danger. It is reality exceeding internal capacity. Too much, too fast, too unknown. When pressure overwhelms, the uncentered fold inward. Breath shortens, posture collapses, thought fragments. The nervous system takes over. In such moments, calm is not a mood. It is structural integrity, the capacity to remain in contact with reality when reality overwhelms. Calm communicates something unmistakable. I am still here. I can still choose. I can still see. This is why calm is respected before strength or intelligence. Calm is the first signal of capacity. The leader is the one who does not rush. Most people meet threat with impulsive action or frantic explanation, trying to escape the discomfort of not yet knowing. The leader pauses, not to freeze, but to look, to absorb what is happening rather than react to what is feared. That pause is discipline. Rushing is the first form of collapse because it allows reality to dictate the response. A leader moves last, not first. The one who moves last has seen more and chooses direction rather than reacting to momentum. When calm is real, it spreads. It slows the breathing of the group, softens interpretation, organizes reaction, and clarifies thought. Chaos becomes sequence. Fear becomes focus. This happens before a word is spoken. Presence alters the emotional geometry of the room. Nervous systems synchronize. Groups settle into the rhythm of the slowest, most deliberate pulse. Leadership is biological long before it is strategic. Competence without calm is not leadership. Brilliant minds disintegrate under pressure. Charisma evaporates when threat appears. A leader is not impressive in favorable conditions. A leader remains themselves when conditions deteriorate. If competence does not hold under threat, it is theater. Leadership is endurance. Calm is rarely gifted. It is forged through suffering, loss, humiliation, collapse, betrayal, and survival. It is not numbness. It is integration. The leader has already carried themselves through what others still fear. This is the threshold. Leadership begins in the ability to stay whole when others fracture. Conclusion to Part 1. The Body Before the Crown. Leadership begins long before language, strategy, or any conscious desire to guide others. It rises from the ancient architecture of the social animal, from the instinct to seek stability and orientation in the presence of someone who carries themselves differently under threat. In this primal layer, stripped of abstraction, we find the true foundations of authority: a nervous system that calms other nervous systems, a posture that signals safety, and a presence around which uncertainty becomes bearable. Before leadership becomes philosophy, it is biology. Before it becomes a role, it is a signal. Before it becomes a burden, it is a need the group itself generates. To understand leadership at this level is to recognize a simple truth. People do not follow because of ideas or declarations. They follow because something older than thought recognizes steadiness in another. Authority does not begin in persuasion. It begins in the body. Part 2. The Formation of Authority. Chapter 5. Legitimacy and the Right to Stand at the Center. Leadership cannot remain instinct alone. Instinct draws attention, but authority must take form. Presence may ignite orientation, but legitimacy is what sustains it over time. Authority is never claimed by the leader. It is granted by the group, and it is granted on one basis alone: the belief that the leader will not betray the center, will not betray the people, the mission, or the meaning that holds the group together. A leader's power is not measured by how many follow them, but by why they do. The right to stand at the center is earned through alignment between what the leader says, what they do, and what they are. When these converge, the group feels coherence. Coherence produces trust, and trust is legitimacy. This trust is not admiration or fear. It is something more fundamental: the felt sense that the leader's presence increases the group's chance of survival. People do not entrust themselves to those who shine. They entrust themselves to those who stabilize. People trust a leader because that leader bleeds and remains. They observe, often unconsciously, who suffers without collapsing, who carries more weight than others, who accepts responsibility when escape is possible, and who tells the truth even when it is costly. These are silent tests, administered continuously. Leadership must cost the leader something. If it has cost nothing, it is not leadership. It is performance. Authority is tested most clearly when the leader first acquires power. Power tempts and distorts. When power is used to elevate the self or silence others, legitimacy fractures. True authority appears in restraint. The leader possesses power, but does not need to use it. The more a leader must force, the less authority they possess. Authority also requires transparency of motive. People can endure hardship and uncertainty, but they cannot endure unclear intentions. Once the group cannot tell whether the leader acts for the mission or for themselves, trust dissolves. This is why the leader must be internally aligned rather than flawless. The group does not need perfection. It needs coherence. Legitimacy rarely collapses through dramatic betrayal. It erodes through small fractures, uncorrected lies, postponed duties, uneven standards, quiet withdrawals from responsibility. Everyone senses the shift before it is named. And once legitimacy frays, force cannot restore it. Obedience may remain, but trust does not. Leadership becomes structure only when the one at the center has earned the right to be there, not through dominance, but through steadiness, transparency, and the willingness to bear weight first. Authority is the group's quiet decision. We trust you to hold us together when we cannot hold ourselves. Chapter 6. The Spine of the Leader. A leader cannot hold a group in coherence if they themselves are fragmented within. When order collapses inward, authority collapses outward. For this reason, the leader must possess a spine, not merely will or resolve, but an interior hierarchy, a governing structure within the self. The spine is the capacity to place impulses in order, to prioritize accurately under pressure, and to decide which part of oneself speaks with authority and which parts must fall into place beneath it. Most people lack this internal order. Their emotions, fears, desires, beliefs, and memories all compete at equal volume. Their inner world is democratic, and because it is democratic, it is unstable. Nothing leads, everything reacts. For a leader, the inner world cannot remain democratic. It must become sovereign. One principle must stand above the rest, and the others must align beneath it. This is not rigidity or suppression. It is governance, the ability to rule oneself before attempting to rule anything else. Without internal sovereignty, no intelligence or competence can sustain authority. Disorder within inevitably becomes disorder without. The leader's inner order becomes the group's outer order. Groups unconsciously mirror the emotional structure of the person at their center. They absorb the leader's relationship to conflict, ambiguity, fear, and dignity. If the leader is reactive, the group becomes chaotic. If the leader is fragile, the group becomes anxious. If the leader is arrogant, the group becomes cruel. But when the leader is disciplined, the group steadies. When the leader is humble, the group becomes sincere. People do not follow instructions. They follow being. Leadership is not behavioral. It is the contagion of internal order. Within every person, 3 centers compete for primacy: the head, the chest, and the gut. Thought, emotion, and instinct struggle for dominance. Without hierarchy, the self fractures, thought paralyzes, feeling destabilizes, instinct becomes destructive. For a leader, these centers must be aligned. Courage must root the self, compassion must animate it, and clarity must crown it. Instinct holds the line, emotion humanizes judgment, and thought orchestrates action. When anyone rules alone, leadership distorts. Because of this order, a leader does not negotiate endlessly with themselves. Ordinary people ask what they feel like doing or what will be approved. A leader asks only, "What is required?" And then they act, not impulsively, but without internal resistance. Emotion is felt, but it does not command. Feeling becomes information, not instruction. This is not hardness. It is mastery. A leader's spine breaks not first through betrayal of others, but through betrayal of truth within themselves. The moment perception is distorted to avoid pain, learning stops and collapse begins. The leader's first loyalty must always be loyalty to truth, even when it wounds. This loyalty is what gives the spine its strength. The spine of a leader is not posture or rhetoric. It is internal hierarchy, integrity of perception, and the refusal to fragment under weight. A leader cannot hold others until they have governed themselves. This inner order is the foundation of all authority. Chapter 7. The Circle of Trust. No leader stands alone, but no leader can stand with everyone. Leadership requires closeness, yet it cannot survive proximity without discernment. A leader cannot open their full mind to the group or distribute doubts, vulnerabilities, and strategic awareness indiscriminately. This is not secrecy. It is structural integrity. The leader carries uncertainties the group cannot metabolize and responsibilities the group cannot yet comprehend. Leadership, therefore, demands a circle, but one shaped by reality rather than sentiment. That circle must remain small, because proximity to the center magnifies everything. Strength becomes influence. Flaws become contagion. When too many stand close, factions form, gossip spreads, and ambition awakens. The inner circle is not a committee or a space for consensus. It is an extension of the leader's spine. 2 to 5 people at most, those capable of holding the leader's real mind without distortion. Beyond that, proximity becomes exposure, and exposure erodes structure. The inner circle is never chosen romantically. It reveals itself under pressure. Resume, admiration, similarity, and ideology do not matter. The circle emerges in crisis. Who remained steady when others panicked? Who stayed humble in success? Who did not collapse under humiliation? Who did not require emotional management? And who did not distort reality through need? These individuals do not drain the leader's energy. Presence with them steadies. Presence with others fragments. This is the test. The circle consists of those who cost nothing to maintain. Trust within this circle is not emotional closeness. Trust is predictability under pressure. The leader must know who will remain intact when the world tilts. Warmth does not guarantee reliability. Shared vulnerability does not guarantee loyalty. Trust is forged through hardship, conflict, and repeated truth-telling. Inside the circle, truth must be speakable without fear, pain acknowledged without panic, and strategy sharpened without emotional distortion. The leader does not need comfort here. They need grounding. Even within the circle, roles are not equal. Every circle requires a counterweight, the one person who can tell the leader they are slipping without destabilizing the center. This is not friendship. It is ballast. Without such a figure, the leader drifts toward self-reference. With them, the leader remains tethered to reality as power accumulates. The greatest danger to the inner circle is flattery. Those who seek proximity to power rather than responsibility become poison. Flatterers soothe instead of clarify, mirror instead of confront, and remove pressure instead of revealing reality. Leaders are not destroyed by critics. Critics strengthen the spine. Leaders are destroyed by those who protect them from truth. The circle of trust is not a luxury. It is what keeps the leader human. Without a circle, the leader collapses inward through isolation. With the wrong circle, the leader collapses outward through distortion. With the right circle, a few psychologically strong, emotionally honest people, the leader can endure the weight of the center without breaking. The strength of leadership does not come from the crowd, but from the integrity of the few who stand close enough to see the human at the core, and steady enough to help that human remain whole. Chapter 8. Loyalty as Shared Memory. People do not remain loyal because of logic, incentives, or ideology. They remain loyal because of memory, because something occurred that bound them to one another beneath preference and convenience. Loyalty is not attachment to a person. It is attachment to a shared past that feels true. Groups are not held together by plans or visions of the future, but by the story they believe they have lived together. The leader does not command loyalty. The leader becomes the custodian of that story. Loyalty begins in shared suffering. A group becomes a group not when it works together, but when it suffers together. Shared comfort produces acquaintances. Shared pleasure produces friends. Shared ambition produces partnerships. Only shared suffering produces brothers and sisters. Pain binds because it reveals character, strips away performance, and forces reliance. In suffering, people discover who the others are when no mask can be maintained. Once a group has endured together, the memory takes root. We survived this together. From that moment, loyalty begins. Suffering binds only if the leader shares the cost. If the leader floats above hardship or escapes it, the group may comply, but it will not attach. People do not give loyalty to someone who merely directs suffering from a distance. They bond with the one who absorbs the hardest blows, carries the heaviest load, and experiences responsibility for the whole as personal. Loyalty is not earned through speeches. It is earned by being the one who pays first. Yet suffering alone is not enough. Memory must be preserved. Groups sustain identity through repeated acts, stories retold, phrases repeated, rituals of silence, mourning, and celebration that accumulate meaning over time. Ritual keeps the origin alive and the purpose intact. The leader does not invent culture. The leader remembers it, ensuring that what once held the group together does not erode through neglect. This is why betrayal wounds so deeply. Betrayal is not only the breaking of trust, it is the breaking of memory. The deepest injury is not practical loss, but the corruption of the past. Betrayal rewrites the story. We did not suffer together. We were not who I believed we were. When the shared story collapses, the group dissolves first at the level of meaning, long before structure fails. For this reason, the leader becomes the keeper of memory. They carry the origin, the cost, the lessons, and the meaning forward when others forget. They remind the group who they are and what they refuse to become. Leadership is exhausting because it requires remembering when others grow tired and protecting meaning when others drift. Loyalty does not ultimately follow the leader as a person. It follows the story the group lived together, the identity shaped under pressure and forged in suffering. The leader is not the source of loyalty. The leader is its guardian. Conclusion to Part 2. The formation of authority. Authority takes shape when presence becomes structure. A leader is not only someone who can endure pressure, but someone whose internal coherence becomes an organizing principle for others. What begins as instinctive orientation becomes authority when the leader's inner hierarchy proves stable over time, when attention remains disciplined, motives remain transparent, and conduct remains aligned under strain. Legitimacy is not granted by title or procedure. It is granted by self-governance, by internal order, and by the small circle that surrounds the leader with truth rather than comfort. Groups do not rally around commands. They rally around coherence. They follow not personality, but the story they share with the leader, a memory shaped by cost, a bond formed under pressure, a sense of us that exists before crisis arrives. Authority solidifies when people recognize a center strong enough to carry fear without distortion and hope without illusion. At its core, authority is continuity made visible, the assurance that what holds the group together will endure when conditions turn against it. Part 3. The Mind of the Leader. Chapter 9. Seeing Clearly. Leadership does not begin with directing others. It begins with seeing. The leader's first responsibility is not to act, persuade, or command, but to understand the situation as it actually is, rather than as they wish it to be, fear it to be, or were taught to interpret it. Most people do not encounter reality directly. They encounter their fears, desires, wounds, and protective narratives. They respond not to events themselves, but to an imagined world shaped to preserve psychological comfort. This is not perception. It is self-defense. The leader cannot afford that luxury. Leadership demands perception without distortion. This clarity does not arise from intelligence alone. Intelligence calculates. Clarity discerns. Intelligence gathers information. Clarity filters it. A mind can be sharp and educated and still remain blind. Clarity sees what intelligence avoids because it is willing to tolerate discomfort in the presence of truth. Most people interpret before they look. They seek confirmation rather than contact, reassurance rather than accuracy. A leader must be willing to endure the pain of direct seeing. If truth demands humiliation, the leader accepts humiliation. If truth demands loss, the leader accepts loss. A lie held by the leader does not remain private. It becomes blindness within the group. A group can only see as clearly as the one at its center is willing to see. To see clearly, the leader must distinguish signal from noise. Every environment is saturated with distraction, emotional surges, narratives, agendas, and drama. The leader does not attend to everything. They attend to what determines everything else. Their perception moves toward roots rather than branches, toward underlying forces, structural tensions, and trajectories already in motion if nothing changes. Clarity also requires acceptance before action. Most people rush to explanation to avoid seeing what wounds their self-image. The leader does not rush. They allow reality to fully appear, even when it contradicts desire or expectation. Only after reality is accepted without distortion can action emerge without corruption. Seeing clearly also means seeing others as they are. The leader looks beyond persona and performance. They notice insecurity, resentment, fatigue, ambition, and loyalty as they actually manifest. This is not cynicism. It is sobriety, the refusal to project virtue or deny danger. Most importantly, the leader sees themselves. They recognize their own patterns of avoidance, blind spots, and emotional triggers. They observe their inner state without judgment, knowing that blindness in the leader becomes fragmentation in the group. A leader must never act from what they refuse to see. Leadership begins, therefore, not with vision or strategy, but with perception unclouded by ego. It begins with the courage to see things as they are, before attempting to change them. Without clear seeing, all action misaligns. With it, even restraint becomes leadership. Chapter 10. Judgment under ambiguity. The leader does not have the luxury of waiting for perfect information. By the time reality becomes fully visible, the moment in which it could be shaped has already passed. Leadership requires the capacity to step into uncertainty, to choose while outcomes remain hidden, and to accept responsibility for whatever follows without excuse or self-protection. Judgment is the art of choosing without certainty, early without rushing, firmly without rigidity. Where the weak crave reassurance, the leader seeks orientation. It is not clarity they wait for, but alignment. Ambiguity is not an obstacle to leadership. It is its natural environment. Nearly every decision that matters is made under conditions of incomplete information, conflicting interests, and emotional pressure. This is not failure of preparation. It is the texture of reality. Those who require certainty collapse into delay or compulsive action. Those who demand stability before they move never move at all. The leader learns to inhabit ambiguity without shrinking. Leadership is not about finding perfect decisions. It is about remaining coherent while choosing. For this reason, the leader does not seek to be right. Leaders who fear blame hesitate until initiative is lost. Leaders who fetishize accuracy surrender momentum. Leaders who cannot tolerate being wrong become prisoners of endless analysis. This posture disguises cowardice as caution. A leader is oriented toward necessity, not correctness. Judgment is not precision. It is the willingness to decide while knowing the decision may be wrong, and recognizing that not choosing is itself a choice with consequences. Judging is therefore not predicting the future. It is weighing what matters more than what. The leader considers timing, senses irreversibility, and reads trajectory, understanding which choices alter the terrain permanently and which can be corrected. This is not simple analysis. It is discernment. Analysis looks outward at data. Discernment looks inward at character, commitment, and capacity. The leader judges who we are before deciding what we should do. Poor outcomes with the right people can be endured. Good plans with the wrong people are fatal. Panic is the collapse of judgment. Panic arises when fear outruns awareness and urgency eclipses importance. A leader cannot panic, not because they are fearless, but because they cannot allow the immediate to override the essential. Reaction protects the self. Leadership protects the whole. Judgment depends on the ability to tolerate tension, silence, disappointment, and the discomfort of the unknown. The leader who cannot bear emotional pressure will consistently choose relief over truth. Once the decision is made, the leader does not over-explain or retreat. They accept the outcome fully. I chose. I carry the cost. This is the emotional center of leadership, accountability without certainty. Leadership is exercised not in clarity, but in the shadow of the unknown. Judgment is not clarity of mind, it is courage of soul. And this is what distinguishes the leader, not that they always choose correctly, but that they choose and remain present for what follows. Chapter 11. Attention as Command. Leadership is not first exercised through orders, directives, or declarations. It is exercised through attention. Whatever the leader attends to, whatever they notice, return to, inquire into, or quietly allow to matter, becomes the gravitational center of the group's world. Attention amplifies salience. Attention creates meaning. People follow the leader's eyes long before they follow the leader's voice. Attention is orientation. Every act of attention silently answers questions the group does not ask aloud. What matters here? What is urgent and what is noise? What deserves effort and what can be ignored? Every focus point becomes a priority. Every omission becomes permission to forget. Cultures are not shaped by mission statements, but by repeated attention. Identity forms not through slogans, but through what consistently draws the leader's concern. Attention is the silent curriculum through which people learn what the world is. For this reason, the leader must guard attention with discipline. Most people surrender attention to whatever provokes emotion, novelty, insecurity, or fear. The leader cannot afford this surrender. Attention must become intentional, selective, and restrained. What the leader attends to becomes the story the group inhabits. Attention fixed on fear produces paranoia. Attention fixed on blame fractures cohesion. Attention fixed on purpose aligns effort. A leader's attention sets the emotional climate in which everyone else must breathe. What a leader attends to reveals their values more clearly than anything they say. People do not believe declarations. They believe patterns of focus. A leader who speaks of courage but avoids conflict teaches fear. A leader who praises truth but rewards flattery teaches distortion. Attention exposes values. Values shape culture. Culture is inferred, not announced, and it is inferred from where the leader's attention consistently rests. In moments of crisis, attention becomes decisive. Fear narrows perception and urgency distorts importance. The leader's task is not to deny danger, but to hold the problem within a larger frame. By stabilizing their own attention, the leader stabilizes the group's imagination and prevents panic from consuming it. Inspiration may be optional. Attentional discipline is not. Leaders rarely fail from lack of intelligence or courage. They fail because attention fragments, captured by insecurity, drained by petty conflict, scattered by noise. Attention is the leader's most precious resource. Not everything deserves to be seen. Not every conflict deserves to be entered. Attention must be reserved for what is essential, structural, and meaningful. Leadership ultimately commands not by force or charisma, but by choosing what to see and allowing that choice to shape the world the group lives inside. What the leader attends to becomes real. What they consistently ignore fades. Attention is destiny, and the leader's destiny, over time, becomes the group's. Chapter 12. Silence as Strategy. Leadership is often mistaken for speaking, for offering guidance, providing answers, persuading, or commanding. Yet speech is not the foundation of leadership. Silence is. Silence creates space for perception, alters emotional dynamics, reveals truth, and allows meaning to arise rather than be imposed. Groups begin to organize around presence long before they respond to words. Speech is the final movement of leadership. Silence is the first. Silence establishes gravity. When most people fall silent, it is from fear or uncertainty. When a leader falls silent, the silence carries weight. It signals patience, self-possession, and internal steadiness. It communicates without display, I am not hurried. I am not reactive. I am still deciding. That stillness becomes a center. Others rush to fill the space with noise. The leader fills it with presence. Silence also compels revelation. In the discomfort of quiet, people expose themselves. They speak to escape uncertainty, to assert control, or to soothe their anxiety. The leader observes what emerges: who panics, who flatters, who dominates, who deflects, and who can tolerate not knowing. Words can disguise. Silence reveals. It becomes a diagnostic field in which character appears without protection. Just as importantly, silence preserves sovereignty. A leader who speaks too frequently dissolves into the group's emotional field. Criticism then feels personal. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Silence maintains distinction. It allows the leader to remain inside the group without being consumed by it. This boundary protects both the leader and the group from dependency and distortion. Silence is also a shield against manipulation. Those who cannot tolerate quiet attempt to provoke reaction, to extract reassurance, incite emotion, or seize control of the moment. When the leader does not react, manipulation loses its leverage. By holding silence, the leader holds the frame, and the one who holds the frame shapes meaning. When the leader finally speaks, the words carry force. Attention gathers. Meaning concentrates. Direction becomes unmistakable. Speech without silence is noise. Speech that follows silence is command. The leader does not speak to express themselves, but to alter reality. The greater the silence a leader can hold, the fewer words they will ever need. Silence is also how the leader remains human. Without a place of quiet, leadership becomes reactive and hollow. Silence is where the leader returns to themselves, not to withdraw from others, but to remain intact while serving them. Silence is not absence. It is presence without compulsion. Leadership is not the act of talking. Leadership is the discipline of being the one who does not need to. Conclusion to Part 3. The Mind of the Leader. The true battleground of leadership is perception. Not charisma, not rhetoric, not force, but the ability to see without distortion in a world saturated with noise, emotion, and ambiguity. Leadership begins to fail the moment perception fractures. Judgment can emerge only when seeing is clean, and decisions remain sound only when the leader can stay inside uncertainty without collapsing into panic, denial, or illusion. Attention functions as command. What the leader consistently attends to expands within the group's awareness, shaping emotional climate and directing action long before any instruction is given. Silence, in turn, the disciplined refusal to overreact, over-explain, or fill space from insecurity, becomes a stabilizing force. It preserves clarity, reveals truth, and maintains coherence under pressure. The mind of the leader is not a feeder of opinions or cleverness. It is a steady lens. Through that lens, the group learns how to see the world, what matters, and how to remain oriented when clarity is scarce. Part 4. The Movement of Leadership. Chapter 13. Carrying the Weight of Others. Leadership is not merely presence, clarity, or legitimacy. These are prerequisites. Leadership becomes real only when the leader begins to carry weight, not tasks or visible labor, but the weight of the group's inner life. The leader carries fear, uncertainty, unresolved conflict, projection, and avoidance of truth. Leadership is not elevation above the many. It is the burden of holding the many within the one. To lead is to suffer, not tragically, but structurally, because the leader must feel more, see more, and accept responsibility for what others cannot yet bear. This weight is not symbolic. It is felt physically, in the tightening of the chest before irreversible decisions, in the exhaustion that follows stabilizing conflict, in the heaviness that lingers after absorbing tension no one else names. The leader carries this weight alone, even when surrounded by people. This solitude is not abandonment, it is role. Leadership contains an unavoidable loneliness of responsibility, because the leader must remain steady while knowing and carrying more than anyone else. The leader absorbs the emotional burden of the collective. Every group generates anxiety, resentment, fear, and confusion. If these forces spread unchecked, the group collapses inward. The leader metabolizes them, holding fear without panic, diffusing aggression before it fractures cohesion, containing uncertainty so others can function. This work is not heroic. It is structural. Leadership is emotional metabolism. The leader feels more so the group can feel less. The leader also carries accountability. When something breaks, they do not hide behind explanations or shift blame. They accept responsibility because the failure occurred under their watch. Accountability is not a tactic. It is identity. Without it, authority loses moral ground. Alongside this, the leader carries projection. Groups place their longing for safety, their unresolved wounds, and their fear of insignificance onto the leader. To remain human under projection requires deep internal grounding. The leader must receive projection without becoming it, and stand inside isolation without resentment or demand for comfort. If the leader refuses this weight, by complaining, withdrawing, or seeking sympathy, the center fractures. Leadership, once assumed, is not optional. Abandonment of weight always precedes collapse. Leadership is not about being followed. It is about bearing what others cannot bear: greater fear, greater responsibility, greater consequence, so the structure holds. The leader does not stand above. The leader stands beneath, carrying the load that keeps the whole intact. Chapter 14. Crisis as Revelation. A group may believe it has a leader, and a person may believe they are a leader. But leadership remains unproven until crisis arrives. Crisis strips away illusion. It dissolves performance, rhetoric, charm, and symbolic authority, revealing what is structural and what was merely decorative. Under pressure, the difference between those who can hold themselves and those who fracture becomes unmistakable. Crisis does not create leadership. It exposes whether leadership was ever present at all. In times of comfort, confidence can be borrowed, fragility concealed, and instability masked by routine or success. Crisis eliminates these disguises. When reality becomes unstable, borrowed strength evaporates. Each person is forced to confront what they are truly anchored in. Some discover that their identity collapses the moment control disappears. Others discover that they do not require certainty or admiration to remain intact. They simply remain themselves. This capacity to remain is the core of leadership. When crisis strikes, the group reorganizes instantly. Leadership is reassigned without discussion. Status rearranges itself according to reality rather than reputation. Those once admired for eloquence or authority drift outward, while those who remain centered step forward. The group turns automatically toward the one who still has a center. Crisis restores hierarchy to truth. In these moments, the leader's nervous system becomes the emotional climate of the group. Panic spreads rapidly, or halts upon encountering a calm, regulated presence. Breathing synchronizes. Attention steadies. The leader's body becomes the stabilizing force that prevents collapse. If the leader fractures, the group fragments into self-preservation. If the leader holds, the group adapts as a single organism. This is not metaphor. It is physiology. Crisis also compresses priority. Comfort allows trivial concerns to inflate. Crisis reduces everything to a single question: what truly matters? The leader must decide what to protect, what to sacrifice, and what must be allowed to fall away. Leadership in crisis is the triage of meaning. Most people cannot perform this task because it requires accepting loss. The leader must allow something to end so something essential can endure. In crisis, the group watches not strategy, but conviction. They sense whether the leader still believes meaning exists beyond hardship. The leader's posture toward the unknown becomes contagious. From it, the group takes its cue for whether to endure or unravel. Crisis is the birthplace of legitimacy. Loyalty does not form because the leader succeeds, but because the group witnesses who the leader is when the world is breaking apart. That memory hardens into identity. Crisis does not make the leader. It reveals them. When the world fractures, the leader is the one who does not. Chapter 15. Conflict, Mercy, and Necessary Severity. A leader is not defined by how they govern peace. Peace maintains what already works. Conflict reveals what does not. It forces decisions about what must be protected, what must be confronted, what can be forgiven, and what must be removed. In conflict, judgment, courage, compassion, and boundary are exposed. Mercy without structure dissolves a group. Severity without compassion brutalizes it. Leadership requires both, and the discernment to know when each is necessary. Conflict is not dysfunction. It is difference exposed under pressure. It reveals misalignment, resentment, weakness, hidden agendas, and deferred truth. Most people treat conflict as threat and attempt to avoid it. Leaders cannot. The leader attends. Conflict is information. It points directly to what can no longer remain unaddressed. Comfort conceals. Conflict clarifies. Mercy is not softness. It is disciplined discernment. Mercy is offered when failure arises from ignorance rather than malice, from fear rather than ego, and when the individual remains oriented toward the center. Mercy is investment in what can still align. But mercy without boundary corrodes the structure. Compassion that dissolves standards poisons the group quietly. Mercy functions only when it protects what can still be integrated. Severity is not cruelty. It is protection of coherence. It is applied when loyalty decays into self-interest, when dissent becomes sabotage, when insecurity turns manipulative, or when incompetence threatens the whole. To tolerate what corrodes the center is to abandon the group. Severity removes what refuses correction, not to punish, but to prevent collapse. It must be clean, decisive, and without theatrics. Timing is decisive. Mercy offered too early breeds entitlement and weakness. Severity applied too early breeds fear and concealment. The leader does not ask what feels fair or comfortable. The leader asks one question only: what preserves coherence? Mercy regenerates. Severity protects. Both are instruments of continuity, and both fail when mistimed. Before acting, the leader must examine motive without illusion. Are they protecting the group or defending wounded pride? Are they cutting from necessity or from anger? Are they forgiving from clarity or from avoidance? Action taken to serve ego corrupts authority. Action taken to avoid discomfort dissolves trust. The leader must be internally clean before acting externally. A structure ruled only by severity obeys, but does not attach. A structure ruled only by mercy decays. Leadership is neither gentleness nor harshness. It is balance under pressure, softness of heart, sharpness of judgment, steadiness of action, and clarity of intent. Mercy is how the leader sustains life within the group. Severity is how the leader prevents its collapse. Real leadership is knowing when to use each, without hesitation or regret. Chapter 16. The Leader's Hand. Action is the moment leadership becomes irreversible. Words can be revised. Silence can be reinterpreted. Intentions can remain unclear, but action commits the future. Once a leader acts, trajectories lock, alliances shift, meaning reorganizes, and identity reshapes. Action is the leader's hand, the point where inner coherence enters the world and leaves a permanent mark. The question is never simply what should be done, but how to act in a way that leaves the group stronger rather than weaker. Through action, the leader teaches what is sacred, what is forbidden, what will be tolerated, and what the future will feel like. Groups learn who they are by watching what the leader does under pressure. If the leader protects the vulnerable, protection becomes culture. If competence is rewarded, competence becomes norm. If excuses are tolerated, self-deception spreads. If conflict is avoided, disorder multiplies. If dissent is punished rather than sabotage, fear replaces honesty. People do not imitate principles. They imitate posture. Action is the transmission of culture. What the leader does becomes what the group becomes. Because of this, the leader's hand must be precise. Power used loosely destabilizes. Power used reactively spreads fear. Power used too slowly invites manipulation. The leader does not ask how to win, but what preserves the center. Action that serves coherence strengthens the group. Action that serves ego, fear, or image fractures it. A leader acts last, not first. They observe, listen, absorb, and wait. This is not passivity but discipline. When the leader finally moves, the action should reduce confusion and restore alignment. If it multiplies chaos or ambiguity, it was premature. The leader acts only when direction has become unavoidable, not when provoked or emotionally compelled. Emotion is present, but it does not command. Anger, grief, exhaustion, and disappointment will arise, often together. Emotion is information, not instruction. The immature leader acts to relieve discomfort. The mature leader acts to protect coherence. This distinction separates command from collapse. The leader never acts to be seen. Action taken for appearance contaminates authority. Real leadership acts quietly, without spectacle. The most decisive actions are often invisible at the moment and unmistakable only in their effects. After acting, the leader does not over-explain. Explanation invites doubt and erosion. If an action requires elaborate defense, it was not clean. The leader stands with the act. Understanding may come later, or not at all. Stability requires trust, not consensus. The leader's hand fixes identity, shapes loyalty, contains fear, and preserves meaning. It acts from stillness, at the right moment, for the sake of the center. It does not dominate. It stabilizes. This is leadership translated into motion. Conclusion to Part 4. The movement of leadership. Leadership becomes real only through action. It is tested in moments when weight must be carried, when crisis strips away illusion, when conflict demands discernment between mercy and necessary severity, and when decisions quietly reshape the identity of the group. Action is irreversible. It fixes direction, establishes boundaries, and teaches the group what is possible, permissible, and worth protecting. The leader does not act to express themselves. They act to preserve coherence. They protect without indulging weakness, confront sabotage without cruelty, and wait long enough to see clearly before moving decisively enough to stabilize. The leader's hand enforces meaning not through force or spectacle, but through precision. Through this movement, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, the group comes to know itself. Action becomes identity made visible. What the leader does teaches the group what it stands for, what it will endure, and what it will never allow. This is leadership in motion. Part 5. The failure of leadership. Chapter 17. Arrogance as decay of perception. Leadership rarely collapses suddenly. It decays quietly and almost invisibly, beginning not outside the leader, but within. The earliest fractures form in private. Attention narrows, empathy thins, presence strains, and decisions slowly turn inward. Tone shifts before language does. Leadership does not fail because the world becomes too heavy. It fails because the leader can no longer carry the world without protecting their ego. Arrogance is not confidence. It is the collapse of perception. Confidence remains grounded in reality, aware of limits and present to conditions as they are. Arrogance replaces contact with self-reference. The world becomes a reflection of the leader's interpretation rather than something to be encountered. Others are no longer seen clearly. The group's evolving needs are missed. Certainty replaces perception. Arrogance is blindness disguised as conviction. This blindness rarely begins in malice. It begins in fatigue. After carrying weight for too long, the leader assumes understanding without looking. Familiarity replaces curiosity. Memory replaces perception. Curiosity fades first. Listening follows. Humility disappears last. When humility dies, arrogance takes its place seamlessly, and the leader remains convinced they are still seeing clearly. This is the tragedy. The leader does not know they are blind. Decay deepens when the leader loses external reference. Instead of calibrating against present reality, resistance, and consequence, they measure themselves against past success. Intuition goes unchecked. Assumptions harden silently. I already know. I cannot be wrong. The leader stops checking. The world keeps moving. Entropy enters through this gap. As perception narrows, admiration becomes soothing and truth becomes abrasive. Flattery replaces challenge. Dissent feels threatening. The inner circle shifts from grounding the leader to protecting them. The group grows quieter, not from alignment, but from fear. Control increases as confidence collapses. Rules multiply. Pressure rises. Initiative dies. Obedience remains, but leadership has already ended. The final fracture occurs when the leader begins protecting themselves instead of the center. Defensiveness replaces openness. Image replaces responsibility. The group no longer rests inside the leader's presence. The leader begins leaning on the group to carry their identity. This inversion is corruption of role. This is decay. Arrogance is not pride. It is blindness born of exhaustion. Leadership does not demand perfection, but it does demand humility as discipline, loyalty to reality over self-image. When that loyalty breaks, leadership dissolves quietly, predictably, and from within. Chapter 18. Isolation and the Loss of Reality. Feedback. A leader begins to fail the moment they lose contact with reality, and reality is not limited to external conditions or visible opposition. Reality also lives inside the group, in its emotional climate, shifting needs, unresolved tensions, emerging threats, and old wounds returning in new forms. Leaders are rarely defeated by enemies. They are defeated by insulation. Isolation is not the absence of people. It is the absence of truth that costs something to hear. A leader may be surrounded by loyalty, affirmation, and applause, yet still be profoundly isolated. Isolated in perception, burden, and clarity. This is the most dangerous form of isolation, believing oneself supported while standing inside a vacuum of reality. Decay begins when the inner circle changes function. What once anchored the leader to truth begins protecting the leader from discomfort. Challenges soften. Hard truths are delayed or wrapped in reassurance. Critique fades into silence. Confrontation becomes affirmation. What was once ballast becomes cushioning. The leader stops hearing reality, while the circle believes it is being loyal. In truth, it is participating in collapse. As authority consolidates, admiration replaces honesty. People seek proximity rather than truth. Admiration feels supportive, but it is corrosive when received without skepticism. Admiration is not love. It is desire for access. Where admiration grows unchecked, truth evaporates. The leader enters an echo chamber in which their own ideas, language, and assumptions return amplified. It looks like unity, but it is self-replication, and self-replication is the death of leadership. Without friction and resistance, calibration is lost. Judgment decays. Collapse follows. In this insulated state, the leader begins to turn away from the inner lives of others. They no longer want to know who is uneasy, resentful, drifting, or quietly suffering. Not from cruelty, but because knowing would require humility, emotional labor, and change. This is the first true betrayal of leadership, sacrificing the group's reality to preserve personal comfort. From here, decay deepens. As isolation grows, the leader becomes a symbol rather than a person. Symbols speak in ideals instead of specifics. They repeat values instead of addressing conditions. Their presence becomes abstract. The group feels the loss immediately, even if they cannot name it. The leader is present but unreachable. This is spiritual abandonment. A symbol cannot carry weight. Reality eventually pushes back through subtle dysfunction, lower morale, disengagement, quiet resentment, unforeseen consequences. The isolated leader responds by intensifying performance. More speeches, more explanations, more directives. Nothing lands. Words fall into emptiness. Leadership collapses silently, long before any visible fall. Isolation does not begin when the leader is alone. It begins when truth stops reaching the leader, and when the leader stops reaching for truth. Leadership rarely ends in catastrophe. It ends in drift. For leadership to survive, the leader must remain open to correction, reachable by contradiction, and exposed to uncomfortable truth. They must insist, without exception, "Do not protect me from what is real." Because leadership ends the moment reality no longer enters. Chapter 19. The Poison of Flattery. The most dangerous threat to leadership is never opposition. Opposition sharpens perception and reveals structure. Leadership is undone by something quieter and more seductive: agreement without honesty. Where opposition confronts reality, flattery removes it. Flattery is not praise. Praise steadies a leader by affirming what is real. Flattery weakens a leader by replacing truth with comfort. Praise reflects reality as it is. Flattery edits reality to make the leader feel secure. What appears supportive is corrosive. Flattery speaks the language of loyalty while avoiding its cost. It seeks proximity rather than truth, approval rather than integrity. Leaders are most vulnerable when they are tired, admired, isolated, or wounded, when emotional relief feels like grace. But relief substituted for truth is the first stage of decay. Flattery rarely arrives as manipulation. It arrives as understanding. You are misunderstood. You do not need to explain yourself. Its unspoken invitation is simple: stop questioning yourself. The moment a leader accepts that invitation, perception begins to narrow. As flattery accumulates, silence is mistaken for agreement and hesitation for loyalty. Nothing overtly false is said, yet much is withheld. Judgment dulls. Timing slips. The leader is not lied to. They are protected from reality. Gradually, the leader shifts from presence to performance. Being seen begins to matter. Image replaces necessity. The leader starts acting like the person being praised rather than the person reality requires. Authority turns theatrical. The center weakens quietly. The group senses this before the leader does. Tone hollows. Decisions feel rehearsed. Trust thins without confrontation. The inner circle reshapes itself around comfort rather than candor. Those who speak truth recede. Those who affirm rise. Reality contact is lost. Flattery then becomes dependency. Criticism feels abrasive. Solitude feels threatening. The leader grows fragile. The role inverts. The group begins carrying the leader. Respect fades without announcement. Flattery always ends in betrayal. The flatterer serves proximity, not coherence. When cost appears, they vanish or turn accuser. Collapse seems sudden only because decay was gentle. Flattery is not a moral flaw, it is perceptual death. And the antidote is not suspicion, but exposure. At least one person willing to wound the leader with truth. Without that voice, leadership is not failing. It is already over. Chapter 20. The Fall of the Center. Every human group depends on a center, an anchoring presence that holds its emotional, psychological, and moral field together. This center is not hierarchy, procedure, or structure. It is the inner coherence of the leader, their clarity, steadiness, and capacity to hold meaning when circumstances destabilize. Groups do not collapse because conditions become difficult or enemies grow strong. They collapse when the center weakens. Leadership is not merely guiding others, it is sustaining the world others must live inside. When the center fractures, the world fractures with it. Collapse rarely arrives as crisis or dramatic failure. It begins quietly, inside the leader's emotional life. Subtle shifts appear. The leader becomes harder to reach. Presence thins. Patience gives way to irritation. Openness becomes guardedness. Speech remains precise but loses warmth. Relationships are managed rather than inhabited. From the outside, the leader may still appear competent and decisive, but something essential has withdrawn. The moment the leader stops feeling the group, they stop carrying it. This is the true beginning of collapse. Groups sense this immediately, even if they cannot articulate it. Morale softens. Initiative declines without resistance. Humor fades and is replaced by caution. People watch more closely and speak less freely. Roles remain, but the warmth that once animated the group disappears. An unspoken recognition spreads. Something is no longer being held. In the space left by the leader's retreat, insecurity emerges, and insecurity always seeks a new center. As insecurity grows, fragmentation begins. Ambitious personalities step forward. Ideological voices grow louder. Old resentments resurface. Quiet alliances form. The leader loses the monopoly on interpretation. The shared world splits into competing narratives. Unity cannot survive without a trusted center of meaning. Sensing this, the leader often attempts to reassert control. Communication increases. Speeches multiply. Directives sharpen. Alignment is emphasized. But these efforts fail because the group no longer trusts the leader's center. The words are heard, but they carry no weight. The leader believes they are protecting the group. The group feels the leader protecting position. Once trust fractures, action cannot restore it. Only renewed internal coherence could, and by this stage, the leader is too depleted to regenerate it. From the outside, collapse appears sudden. It never is. The fall is emotional before it is structural. Crisis does not cause collapse. It exposes it. Leaders fall slowly, in fatigue, unprocessed grief, and emotional withdrawal rationalized as discipline. When the leader finally breaks, the group mourns more than the individual. It mourns the world the leader sustained: identity, coherence, meaning. The grief is not personal. It is existential. The collapse of the leader is experienced as the collapse of the world. Leadership does not fail because leaders are flawed. It fails when the leader loses the capacity to remain emotionally open while carrying responsibility. When listening stops, humility fades, and truth no longer enters, connection is lost. To lead is to remain whole. When the center holds, the world holds. When the center fractures, the world dissolves around it. Conclusion to Part 5. The Failure of Leadership. Leadership rarely collapses through external attack. It decays from within. Arrogance narrows perception. Isolation seals the leader inside reflection. Flattery replaces truth with comfort, and emotional withdrawal fractures the center long before any visible crisis appears. These failures begin quietly, in tone, posture, and orientation, well before they surface in decisions, breakdowns, or public defeat. The group senses the decay before it can explain it. Trust thins. Coherence weakens. Rival centers begin to form. The shared world the leader once sustained dissolves from the inside out. The deepest tragedy is not the fall of the leader, but the loss of the world the group lived within, the identity, meaning, and continuity that depended on a stable center. To understand failure is not to condemn the leader. It is to recognize the fragility inherent in carrying others. Leadership always risks collapse, and that collapse is often preventable only through humility, remaining open to truth, receptive to correction, and loyal to reality over self. Leadership fails not in catastrophe, but in the neglect of the inner conditions that once made coherence possible. Part 6. The Renewal of Leadership. Chapter 21. Humility After Power. When a leader collapses, a strange silence follows. The pressure of responsibility, the weight of expectation, and the strain of sustaining coherence fall away at once. In that silence, the former leader faces a choice. They can deny what happened and cling to a fractured identity, blaming betrayal, circumstance, or others. Or they can turn toward the truth they had been avoiding. Collapse did not arrive from outside. It emerged from within. Denial protects the ego from humiliation, but it preserves the forces that cause the fall. Renewal begins only with acceptance, with honest self-witnessing, and change born not of shame, but of clarity. Humility after power is not self-diminishment. It is the removal of distortion. Humility does not mean shrinking, apologizing for strength, or performing modesty. It is far more radical. It is the moment the leader stops confusing themselves with the world. Performance ends, defenses drop, justifications dissolve. The leader returns to observation, to listening, to learning, to direct contact with reality. When humility is real, the leader becomes a student again, alive, receptive, unguarded. This is the first breath after collapse. Failure strips away the illusion that the leader was the source of coherence. What remains is the recognition that they were only the conduit. Grandiosity burns off. Identity loosens. Leadership sheds performance and becomes function again. Authority sheds image and becomes responsibility. This is not weakness, but maturity. The dignity that arrives only after ego dissolves. During decay, leaders often numb emotion to survive. Feeling others becomes overwhelming, so sensitivity is compressed and whole regions of the self are sealed off. Renewal requires the return of emotion, not as chaos, but as contact. The leader relearns how to feel grief without collapse, empathy without losing boundary, care without control. Emotional openness is not fragility. It is the restoration of the living self. Without it, leadership hardens. With it, leadership becomes presence again. Renewal cannot occur alone. It requires a witness, one person who sees without distortion, who is neither impressed nor afraid, who offers neither comfort nor flattery, but truth. This witness prevents the rebuilding of ego in place of self. Without such a presence, the leader recreates the same structure that failed. With it, self-deception becomes impossible. The final work is grief. The leader grieves who they became, the blindness that formed, the harm done, and the parts of themselves sacrificed to identity. This grief is not punishment. It is purification. When endured cleanly, without denial or dramatization, what is false falls away, and what is real returns. What emerges is quieter, clearer, more grounded, and fully human. Humility after power is not collapse. It is restoration. It is leadership freed from intoxication and hunger. The leader who returns does not rise to reclaim authority, but to serve coherence rather than self. This second leadership is less visible and far more enduring. Leadership purified no longer needs to lead. Leadership purified is presence without possession. Chapter 22. Rerouting the self in reality. After collapse, a leader does not rise immediately. The first movement is not ascent, but descent, a return from altitude to ground. Leadership had carried them into thin air, into projection, admiration, abstraction, and the emotional numbness demanded by constant responsibility. These are conditions unnatural to the human organism. Renewal, therefore, requires coming down, into the body, into time, into ordinariness, into imperfection, and into the soil of existence from which they once rose. This descent is not a fall. It is a rerouting. The leader must remember what is real when no one is watching, what remains when nothing dramatic is happening, and what feels true without audience or significance. Rerouting is the slow retrieval of being. Reality returns first through the body. Before collapse, the leader's body had become armor, tight with vigilance, performance, and containment. Renewal begins when that armor softens. Sleep returns without vigilance. Breath loosens. Movement becomes uncalculated. Sensation resumes its authority. Hunger, fatigue, texture, weight, and rhythm reconnect the leader to a world that exists independently of role. Thought alone cannot restore clarity, because thought was where distortion accumulated. The leader must return through embodiment. The body tells the truth without agenda. The second demand of reality is slowness. During decay, everything accelerated. Decisions outran understanding. Reaction preceded perception. Speed replaced presence. Slowing reverses this damage. Speech slows until intention meets words. Breath slows until fear exits the body. Attention slows until reality is noticed rather than imagined. Action slows until it is chosen rather than compelled. Slowness is not weakness. It is the restoration of human time. Reality is rediscovered in ordinariness, making tea without urgency, walking without destination, listening without preparing a response, sitting without distraction. These acts are not trivial. They restore soul. Here, the leader is no longer a symbol or center. They are simply human among humans. Leadership cannot be reborn until personhood is restored. Rerouting also requires allowing oneself to be seen as human again, wrong without shame, uncertain without defense, imperfect without fear. The leader must permit help, honesty, and unguarded witnessing. This exposure dissolves the symbolic identity that once sustained authority. Renewal depends on shedding the role and rediscovering what it means to be valued without function, held without power, and regarded without myth. Finally, rerouting requires releasing the old story. Narratives of indispensability, sacrifice, and exceptionalism must fall away. These stories once stabilized identity, but they also distorted reality. When they dissolve, something quieter remains: presence instead of performance, truth instead of image, service instead of ego. The leader does not return to who they were before leadership, but to who they were beneath it all along. Rerouting is the work of softening the body, slowing time, accepting ordinariness, shedding role, and releasing illusion. Only from this ground can leadership emerge again, clean, undistorted, no longer afraid of collapse and no longer hungry for recognition. The leader returns to the earth so that when they stand again, they stand as themselves. This is what makes the second leadership real. Chapter 23. The leader who does not need to lead. The highest form of leadership is almost invisible. It does not announce itself, seek recognition, obedience, admiration, or applause. It does not rely on charisma, command, or symbolic authority. It is a quiet, steady presence, clear, unforced, and self-contained. This leader does not hunger for followers or depend on being seen as a leader at all. They step forward only when reality requires it, and step back as soon as coherence can hold without them. Leadership is no longer an identity to inhabit. It has become a function, a response to necessity rather than a role to perform. The paradox is simple. The less the leader tries to lead, the more deeply others orient toward them. In early leadership, a person often strives to prove something, to themselves, to the group, to the story they believe they are living inside. Leadership is effortful because identity is at stake. But after collapse and renewal, this striving dissolves. There is no image left to defend and no performance to maintain. Presence justifies itself. Influence no longer arises from assertion, but from coherence. The leader does not attempt to inspire. They remain aligned with reality, and that alignment exerts its own gravity. This is authority without insistence, strength without pressure. As ego recedes, influence changes its nature. People do not follow because of symbolic power or emotional magnetism, but because something in the leader restores orientation. Anxiety lowers in their presence. Priorities reorganize. Confusion settles into sequence. The leader does not impose direction. They create the conditions in which direction becomes obvious. Leadership becomes resonance rather than control, gravity rather than gesture. In this stage, the leader is no longer the center of the group's identity. The center becomes shared and sustained collectively. The leader's task shifts from occupying coherence to protecting it. They remain attentive and unobtrusive, guarding against ego, fear, resentment, and distortion. Their influence is felt more than seen. They stabilize rather than dominate. Speech becomes rare. When the leader speaks, it is because speaking is necessary, not to express themselves, but to restore alignment. Their words are simple and precise. Silence becomes natural, not strategic. Words carry weight precisely because they are no longer used to construct identity. A leader at this stage cannot be flattered, provoked, or destabilized. Their sense of self is no longer anchored in role or admiration. Even stripped of authority, they remain a leader, because leadership has ceased to be positional. It has become personal. The deepest transformation of this second leadership is generative. The first phase produces followers. The second produces maturity. The leader steps back deliberately, creating space for others to grow, decide, and carry responsibility. Their legacy is not personal influence, but a structure that remains coherent in their absence. When they leave, the center does not collapse. It endures. This is the highest form of leadership: presence without possession, authority without performance, influence without hunger. Leadership that appears when necessity calls and disappears when it is no longer needed. Chapter 24. Presence without possession. When leadership has passed through collapse and renewal, something fundamental changes in how the leader inhabits the world. Leadership no longer announces itself. It no longer asserts, demands, or reaches outward for confirmation. Its expression becomes quiet and almost invisible. The leader remains fully present, but without the impulse to possess, to claim influence, to guard authority, or to anchor identity in being followed. They stand at the center the way a mountain stands in a valley, shaping the terrain by its existence alone. This is mature leadership, authority without performance, presence without demand. In early leadership, recognition functions as emotional oxygen. Being needed, acknowledged, and deferred to sustains identity. To lose visibility feels like diminishment. To share authority feels like erosion. But after collapse and renewal, recognition loses its necessity. The leader no longer depends on admiration or centrality to feel real. If someone else steps forward to carry the weight, the leader does not feel threatened. They feel relief. Leadership is no longer ownership. It is stewardship. What matters is not who carries the weight, but that the weight is carried. This shift appears most clearly in the leader's relationship to control. Immature leadership asserts authority frequently, mistaking intervention for strength. Mature leadership does the opposite. Its stability is so deep that control is rarely required. Restraint itself becomes the signal of authority. When the leader acts, the action is clean and unadorned, correcting before collapse, without spectacle. The group is held, but not infantilized. Responsibility spreads. Strength becomes shared. Because leadership is no longer rooted in ego, the leader is not threatened by the strength of others. Growth elsewhere is not competition, it is success. The metric has changed. The leader no longer asks whether they are admired or central. They ask only whether the center is healthy, whether coherence is holding, whether the structure is stronger than before. This is the difference between possession and stewardship. This maturity is tested most clearly in response to conflict and criticism. When identity is no longer fused to role or reputation, attack does not destabilize. The leader does not defend reflexively, because nothing fragile remains to protect. They act from alignment, not approval. They trust time more than image. What is true will endure. As a result, the leader's movements grow subtle. Immature leadership moves loudly. Mature leadership moves quietly. It corrects without display and influences without announcement. The group orients instinctively around this presence because it is reliable, unreactive, and free of personal agenda. Leadership becomes gravity rather than persuasion. Over time, the group internalizes this presence. The leader's way of being becomes culture. Coherence remains even when the leader steps back or is no longer present. This is completed leadership, a world that continues without its originator. The legacy is not loyalty to a person, but continuity of coherence. Leadership is no longer something the leader does. It is simply who they are. Conclusion to Part 6. The renewal of leadership. Renewal begins where ego breaks. When the old identity dissolves, the leader is forced back into contact with reality through humility, slowness, embodiment, and the ordinary rhythms of human life. What emerges is not weakness, but clarity, a self no longer distorted by ambition, projection, or exhaustion. The leader who returns from collapse does not lead to be central. They lead because they can now hold others without needing anything from them. Authority becomes unforced. Influence becomes gravitational. Presence stabilizes because it is no longer driven by insecurity or the hunger for validation. This is the second birth of leadership. Leadership without performance, authority without possession, influence without ego. Renewal is not the improvement of the old self, but the recovery of the self beneath the role. Part 7. The Ascent of Leadership. Chapter 25. The leader as teacher, not commander. Leadership does not conclude with achievement, authority, or success. It concludes with transmission, with the question of whether the world the leader once held together can endure once they are no longer present to hold it. In its final stage, leadership is no longer about directing the group or standing at the center as the primary stabilizer. It becomes the responsibility of ensuring that the center survives without the leader. Leadership crosses into teaching, not through instruction or doctrine, but through the shaping of perception, character, and responsibility in others. In the early phase of leadership, others look to the leader for direction. In the mature phase, they look to the leader to understand how to carry themselves. The purpose of leadership is not to create followers, but to form adults, people capable of deciding under pressure, carrying responsibility without reassurance, protecting others without cruelty, and holding coherence when no authority is present to lean on. Leadership reaches its highest form when it transfers the capacity to protect what the leader once carried alone. The first way a leader teaches is through being, not explanation. People learn by observing how the leader behaves when pressure arrives, how fear is regulated, how responsibility is assumed, how mistakes are corrected without self-protection. Every moment under strain becomes instruction. Embodiment, not rhetoric, is the medium of transmission. The leader also teaches others how to see. They pass on perceptual clarity, how to read reality without distortion, how to sense emotional undercurrents, how to distinguish signal from noise, urgency from importance, ambition from devotion. Leadership begins in accurate perception, not assertion. More demanding still, the leader teaches others how to hold themselves. They allow struggle to form spine, difficulty to educate, and consequence to teach, where rescue would only create dependency. This is not abandonment, it is maturation. A group that can hold itself does not collapse when the leader steps away. Finally, the leader teaches others how to protect the center. Responsibility for coherence must become shared. Others must learn disciplined mercy, necessary severity, and loyalty to meaning rather than to individuals. When the center belongs to everyone, continuity becomes possible. Teaching at this level requires restraint. The leader must step back, allow others to carry weight, and resist the impulse to intervene. If the group still requires the leader for stability, leadership has not completed its work. The goal is not dependence. The goal is capacity. In the end, the leader becomes a teacher precisely because they no longer need to lead. Their presence shapes without effort. Their absence strengthens rather than weakens the structure. Leadership completes its ascent here, not as command, but as stewardship, transmission, and continuity. Chapter 26. The Shape of Continuity. Legacy is not replication. It is not the preservation of mannerisms, tone, or aesthetic style. Legacy, in its deepest sense, is continuity, the transmission of an inner ordering principle that allows a group to remain itself after the leader is gone. When followers attempt to copy a leader too literally, the result is not coherence, but parody. The gestures survive, but the alignment is lost. What remains is imitation without life. Continuity requires preserving essence while releasing personality. Leadership is not a style to be repeated. It is a way of holding reality. Temperament, voice, habits, and methods belong to the individual and must pass with them. But standards must endure. How truth is spoken when it is costly. How conflict is held without collapse. How decisions are made without panic or ego. How responsibility is carried without spectacle. These invisible standards form the moral spine of the group. If they remain intact, the group endures. If they decay, no ritual can save it. For continuity to be real, the group must learn to think rather than repeat. Imitation produces dependency, reflection produces maturity. If a leader teaches what to think, the structure fails when conditions change. If the leader teaches how to see, how to read a room, sense resentment beneath silence, recognize insecurity disguised as aggression, separate urgency from importance, then the group inherits clarity rather than doctrine. They inherit the center itself. Continuity is also carried through memory. Shared hardship, origin stories, and moments of transformation must be preserved, not as romantic myth, but as honest reminders of what the group learned about itself. These memories survive through stories, rituals, and symbols that anchor meaning. They are not decorative. They are the nervous system of continuity. Succession is essential. A leader cannot be replaced like a functionary. Succession is not about talent, popularity, or ambition. It is about transferring the center to someone capable of carrying it without distortion. Someone who remains whole under pressure, who does not require admiration to stay stable, whose ambition has already burned away. Succession is gradual, relational, and largely unspoken. What is transferred cannot be written down. For continuity to complete itself, the leader must let go. Leadership fails when the leader clings to relevance or mistakes presence for necessity. The leader was never the purpose. The work was. When the leader can see the structure standing without them and recognize this as success, the arc is complete. Continuity is not the leader living forever in the group. Continuity is the group learning to live without the leader while remaining whole. This is legacy. Chapter 27. Succession and the Art of Leaving. The final act of leadership is not the taking of power, nor its consolidation. It is the release of power, the moment a leader steps away without the world they helped build collapsing behind them. For many leaders, this is where strength finally fails. They can endure pressure, crisis, conflict, and sacrifice, but they cannot endure irrelevance. They cling to recognition, to being needed, to the comfort of remaining the center. By staying just a little too long, they suffocate the very generation meant to carry the work forward. The tragedy of late leadership is not tyranny, it is stagnation. When leaders remain beyond their season, they become the bottleneck through which all future potential must pass. Initiative slows, responsibility concentrates upward, dependence replaces maturity. The structure weakens not through malice, but through the leader's inability to imagine a world that no longer requires them. Leadership is not measured by how firmly one holds the center, but by whether the center remains standing once one has left it. A leader's work is complete long before the leader feels ready to leave. The signs are subtle but unmistakable. Decisions are made without consultation. Conflicts resolve without escalation. Standards are upheld without enforcement. Meaning is preserved without reminders. The structure regulates itself. Leadership has become an ecosystem. This is the quiet triumph of leadership, to make oneself unnecessary. Recognizing this moment requires detachment. The leader must observe without inserting themselves into every movement of the group. They must find the courage to leave without being asked. This demands humility rather than confidence. Leaving well is gradual, not abrupt. Sudden departure is abandonment. True succession unfolds through restraint. The leader speaks less, decides less, intervenes only when coherence itself is threatened. They allow others to carry responsibility even when they could do it better themselves. Presence recedes, but coherence remains. The leader now teaches through absence. Restraint becomes the final discipline. Departure must be chosen before it is forced. If the leader waits until exhaustion, erosion of trust, or crisis pushes them out, leaving becomes fracture rather than transfer. Succession must occur while the leader is still whole. The group must see the leader leave from clarity, not collapse. This teaches that leadership is stewardship, not self-destruction. The leader leaves not because they are no longer capable, but because the group is. The deepest test comes after departure. To leave well, the leader must relinquish the desire to remain central in memory. They must allow their name to fade without resentment. If they require remembrance, they will linger. If they need to be missed, they will undermine succession. The mature leader understands. To be remembered is sentimental. To be unnecessary is immortal. The final movement of leadership is a return to ordinariness. The leader steps down fully and re-enters life as a person among people, with limits, relationships, and a body no longer carrying the center. They return to the world they once left in order to lead. Only now, they return whole. This return is not diminishment, it is restoration. To leave without collapse is the rarest form of strength. It is leadership completed. Chapter 28. The Leader's Legacy, the Transmission of Being. Legacy is almost always misunderstood. It is imagined as monuments, institutions, achievements, or stories told after a leader is gone. It is treated as memory, a narrative shaped by others once the leader no longer stands at the center. But legacy is none of these. It is not what the leader built, accumulated, or inspired admiration for. Legacy is the shape of being a leader leaves within others. A leader's true work is measured not by outward impact, but by internal transformation. The essential question is simple. How do people now hold themselves because this leader once existed? How do they face difficulty, carry responsibility, meet truth, maintain coherence, and protect meaning? The answers to these questions constitute legacy. Legacy is not the transmission of instruction or ideology. It is the transmission of orientation, a way of standing inside reality. When the leader is gone, influence does not vanish. It relocates. Presence becomes interiority. Guidance moves inward. In moments of pressure or uncertainty, people pause and sense not what the leader would have done or said, but how they would have been. This is not imitation, which is shallow. It is alignment. The leader becomes an internal reference point, a quiet compass that reorients perception rather than dictates action. Influence survives not in copied behavior, but in inherited awareness. If leadership was real, grounded in being rather than performance, the group begins to treat itself differently. Dignity becomes implicit. Loyalty becomes natural. Honesty becomes habitual. Power is exercised without injury. Responsibility is shared without resentment. No one announces that these qualities came from the leader. They simply emerge. What was once carried by one becomes collective character. Presence dissolves into culture. The truest measure of leadership appears in what others can now build. If leadership succeeded, people can act without permission, carry responsibility without fear, and protect coherence without demanding authority. This is the multiplication of being. Legacy is not the preservation of what the leader created, but the expansion of what the leader enabled. Others will build futures the leader will never see. In that unseen continuation, the leader's work completes itself. Legacy is capacity, not conservation. A leader does not leave commandments. A leader leaves a life. People remember, quietly, somatically, how the leader stood in crisis, listened without judgment, acted without spectacle, carried suffering without bitterness, and departed without resentment. This becomes instruction of another kind, wisdom lived rather than quoted. When leadership is complete, the leader does not haunt the structure they leave behind. They permeate it. They are no longer looked up to, but looked through, like a lens. Their influence survives as a tone of clarity, a way of deciding, a boundary against chaos. They do not endure as a name. They endure as a structure of being. This is the final transmission. Conclusion to Part 7. The Ascent of Leadership. The final ascent of leadership is the release of identity into legacy. The leader becomes a teacher rather than a commander, a cultivator rather than a controller. Success is no longer measured by the preservation of form, but by the transmission of discernment, dignity, and coherence. Succession becomes the final test. Whether the leader can step away without collapse, whether the center survives in others, and whether the essence endures without dependence on the person. Beyond succession lies the quietest form of authority, a presence that stabilizes without exertion, a center that no longer requires recognition. In the end, the leader's greatest achievement is not to be remembered, but to be unnecessary. The world continues, steady and whole, because something essential has been transmitted into the structure of others. This is legacy. This is completion. Epilogue. Leadership does not end in spectacle. It ends quietly, in the moment a group no longer needs the one who once held it together. There is no applause when others become strong enough to carry themselves. No ceremony marks the leader who steps aside so the structure can breathe on its own. And yet this is the highest achievement leadership can reach: to cultivate human beings who stand without reassurance, who carry their own fear, their own choices, and their own responsibility, and to release the center without watching the world collapse behind it. A true leader is not remembered as an authority, but as a way of orienting toward reality, a tone, a posture, a presence that once steadied the whole. Leadership is not measured by how many followed while you stood in front. It is measured by what remains when you are no longer there, by how many can walk without leaning, decide without permission, and protect the center without your voice to guide them. Every leader eventually leaves. What matters is whether the world they shaped continues to stand. If it holds, if coherence survives your absence, then your leadership was real. If everything collapses the moment you step away, then what was built was not strength, but dependence. There is no grandeur in this final stage, only the quiet knowledge that the work was never about you, but about what you placed into others. This is enough. Final note. This book does not ask anything of you. It does not demand that you lead, step forward, or become something larger or more visible. If nothing in you stirs after reading these pages, nothing has failed. Leadership is not a moral obligation or a destiny to pursue. It is a condition that sometimes emerges when circumstances require it, often when no one else is able or willing to stand. If you recognized yourself here, it is not because you were meant to lead. It is because you have already carried weight. You have already held fear, ambiguity, conflict, or responsibility longer than was comfortable or acknowledged. You have already learned, perhaps without language, that presence matters more than performance, that steadiness stabilizes more than persuasion, and that coherence can be the only thing preventing a world from fracturing. This book was written for recognition, not recruitment. It does not create leaders. It names what leadership looks like when it has already occurred. You are not expected to apply what you have read. These words are not tools, techniques, or instructions. They are descriptions of reality as it appears when leadership is real. If they remain with you, they will do so quietly, not as rules, but as orientation, not as ambition, but as clarity. If you are never called to stand in this way, that is not failure. It is rest. If you are called, you will recognize the moment without permission, encouragement, or validation. Leadership, when it appears, is not something one pursues. It is something one endures. And when it passes, it should pass cleanly, without nostalgia, without clinging, and without the need to be remembered. Close this book without urgency and return to your life. Return to the ordinary rhythms that make human existence whole. Be present without role or performance. If the world ever tilts again and you find yourself standing when others cannot, you will not need to recall these pages. You will already know what to do. This book ends where leadership itself ends, not in command, not in identity, not in legacy, but in wholeness. Written by Aren, Kairos. Narrated by Lyra, Selene.